Hello, 8th graders. Today we are going to be working with solving quadratic equations, and I'll talk to you about what that actually means. I can solve a quadratic equation by taking square roots. Vocabulary: roots of the equation and zeros of the function. The solution of a quadratic equation and the related x-intercepts. What we're really trying to find today is if I were to graph this function, where does it cross the x-intercept or the x-axis? What is the x-intercept? That's what it is when we are finding the solution. So today we're just going to do that mathematically, and later on we will graph it and you'll see how that comes together. Solve each equation by finding square roots. If the equation has no solutions, write no solutions. If the value is irrational, round to the nearest tens place. So our first example is x squared is equal to 64, and we want to solve for x. Just like if I'm adding an equation, like if I was doing x plus 4 equals 64, I would use the opposite operation of addition to solve this problem. Well, the same thing applies when I'm squaring. So because I'm squaring, I'm going to use the opposite of squaring, and that is to find the square root. So to solve this problem, I'm going to take the square root of the left side of the equation, and I'm going to take the square root of the right side of the equation. The square root of x squared is x. I'm going to bring down the x. I'm going to line up my equal sign. And I know that the square root of 64 is 8, but it also could be negative 8 because negative 8 times negative 8 is 64, and positive 8 times positive 8. So either of these answers is okay. We just have to understand that it's not a positive times a negative that gives us a positive answer. It's going to be negative times negative or positive times positive. So either way is okay in terms of how to express your answer. Moving on to number 2. Number 2, n squared minus 256 equals 0. So because it's equal to 0, then we're going to just try to isolate. Just like when you're trying to solve an equation, we always talk about isolating the variable, whether it just be n. In this case, it's n squared. So we want to get n squared by itself. To do that, we simply add 256 to both sides of the equation. Line up your equal signs. I end up with n squared is equal to 256. From here, we have one more step. We're almost there. We're not trying to solve for n squared. We're trying to solve for n. So we're going to take the square root of both sides of the equation. The square root of n squared is n, and the square root of 256 is 16. And just like in the last example, when we're talking about an equation, it could be positive 16 times positive 16, or negative 16 times negative 16. So we have to make sure we include both answers for our solution set. 4s squared equals 49. This is sort of like when we do 4s is equal to 49. If I was going to solve that, then I would just divide by the coefficient on both sides. That's exactly what we're going to do here. We're trying to ultimately solve for s, so to get s squared by itself, we want to divide by 4 on both sides of the equation. When I do that, I end up with s squared on the left, and I'm just going to leave this as 49 over 4 and recognize that both of those are squares of a number. So to get s squared by itself, we're going to take the square root of s squared, and I'm also going to take the square root of 49 fourths. The square root of s squared is s, and then the square root of 49 is 7. The square root of 4 is 2. So we're going to look at those numerators and denominators individually and then just take the square root. And it's fine for you just to leave it as 7/2. Number 4. 2g plus 32 equals 0. So we want to get 2g squared by itself. To do that, I want to subtract 32. 2g squared equals negative 32. And from here, I would divide through by the coefficient of 2. And I end up with a negative 16. Now what are we going to do? G squared equals negative 16. Is it possible to take the square root of negative 16? In other words, is there something that I multiply by itself to get negative? That's not going to work out because it would take a positive and a negative to get to a negative 16. So from here, we can just say there is no solution. So you're going to have to kind of stop and think about that when anytime you end up with a negative and the variable squared is equal to that, then it will be no solution once we get down to this step. Number 5, we have a decimal. Don't let that scare you. We're still going to handle this exactly the same way by trying to isolate h or get it by itself. So to do that, I'm going to subtract 0.12 or 12 hundredths on both sides of the equation. Once I cancel that out, 7h squared equals what? 1.12. From here, we're going to divide through by 7. H squared equals 1.12 divided by 7 looks like 0.16. And even though it's a decimal, I hope that you recognize that as a number that could be a perfect square. So we're going to take the square root of h squared. We're going to take the square root of 16 hundredths. We end up with h is equal to, don't forget the plus or minus, and that's going to give me what, 0.4? And that is the final answer. So if you're not sure if that's 0.04 or 0.4, you're going to want to put that in your calculator to make sure that you get the right answer. Moving on, we have another example. This time our coefficient is a fraction. That's why I included this in our work today. So we want to do what? Subtract 3? Yep, subtract 3. Oops. Subtract 3 on both sides of the equation. I end up with negative, I'm going to write it like this, negative 1/4 x squared is equal to negative 3. To isolate a fraction, or I'm sorry, to isolate the variable and to get rid of the fraction, we know that we always multiply by the reciprocal, because ultimately we are dividing by negative 1/4, but mathematically our brains can't do that. Our calculator can do that. You always divide by the coefficient. Well, dividing by the coefficient is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So make sure that you do include the negative. Since it was a negative 1/4, you're going to be multiplying by a negative 4 on both sides. Once you've done that, then you end up with x squared is equal to, we've got a negative times a negative on the right. That's going to give us a positive. So from here, then we'll take the square root of both sides. We end up with x is equal to, and it's going to be positive or negative. I'm running out of space over there. It said in the directions to round it to the nearest tenths place. So I think it ends up 3.46. So we're going to say our final answer is positive or negative 3.5. That's our final. All right, we have a couple of word problems that I want you to look at so we can see some scenarios where this might come up in the real world. Model each problem with the quadratic equation, then solve, if necessary, round to the nearest tenth. Find the side of a square with an area of 400 centimeters square. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of get my bearings, and I'm just going to draw a picture, and it's telling me that for this square, the area is 400 centimeters squared. So we're going to just kind of work backwards with this. Here's my formula, right? Area is equal to, if it's a square, then that's going to be side squared. And I know that the area is 400, so there's our formula. We can plug in 400 for A. So 400 equals S squared. And now we know what to do. This goes back to our first problem, our first example today. From here, we're going to take the square root of s squared and give us s, and then the square root of 400, and we're going to say 20. Now, do we want a positive and negative? Not if we're talking about area, and in this case, we're talking about one side length, then we know that that has to be positive. So we don't want to just kind of be robotic and always put positive and negative. We want to think, does that answer make sense? So if we're talking about one side, then that side would be 20 centimeters. And then, of course, 20 times 20 goes back to our area of 400. Don't forget your centimeter label. All right, find the radius of a circle with an area of 126 inches squared. So once again, I'm just going to get my bearings, draw a circle, right? And it tells us that the area, we're trying to find the radius, right? That's what's in question here. And that the area is 126 inches squared. So the first thing I have to do is remember the formula for area. Area is equal to pi r squared. That's the formula for area. So we're going to substitute in the parts that we know to figure out the parts that we don't know. We know the area. We know pi. I'm just going to put in 3.14 for pi. And we don't know the r. So far, so good. So we need to isolate r squared or get it by itself. To do that, I would simply divide by 3.14 on both sides of the equation, and I end up with 40.13 here, and r squared on the right, because those are going to cancel, of course. Now, last step, you may have guessed it, we're going to find the square root of both sides, so we end up with r is 6.3, and go back and let's look at our label. We're talking inches here. So our radius is 6.3 inches. All right. I hope you enjoyed your lesson today on finding the square roots using quadratic or from quadratic equations.